one or two making their way in. Professor Lennox, I have my thanks to you for coming this evening. Welcome to Monmouth, or welcome back to Monmouth. We're delighted you've come, and we want to hear from you as much as possible, so let's begin. If I may, I'll ask you some questions to get our discussion going, and then that Slido.com Ask Lennox provision will allow people to pose a question, or if you see a question which interests you, you can click on it that you'd like to have that question asked, and then I will see here on my screen which are the most popular questions, and we'll try to put those to you. So just to start, it would be helpful for those who are unfamiliar with your work to know a little bit about you. The most important of which will be, do you support Wales and the Six Nations, or just whoever is playing England?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first say, it's really thrilling to be in a school. I'd heard of Haberdasher's School years ago in Northern Ireland, and I come here tonight, never having been before, and to my amazement, a teacher comes up to me, a teacher of mathematics, who says, "You taught me." And that is really a very encouraging thing. So let's get to the question, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I'll try and answer your questions as best I can. Of course, it is essentially a Q&A, so you will plumb the depths of my ignorance quite rapidly. But that's fine, because we don't know the answers to all questions, do we? So now your first question was?
Well, a serious question, I guess, or you gave me permission to ask you something about your background. My own background, my father came to Christian faith, age 40, coming to a lecture similar to this one, and that changed the course of his life and that of my family. I wonder, are you a Christian simply because you grew up in Ireland?
Freud might have asked me that question if he was still alive. And it's a very perceptive question in a way, because it's one that I get hit with, of course, because I remember in my first week at Cambridge, many years ago, in fact last century, in my first week at Cambridge, a student asked me at dinner, he said, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "I'm so sorry. You're Irish and you all believe in God and you fight about it." And that actually, the question was a turning point, because I realized that in Ireland, I hadn't really met any serious atheists. I mean, I met people that call themselves Protestant atheists or Catholic atheists, but never met people who were dyed-in-the-wool atheists. And I decided on that day that I was going to get to know people who did not share my worldview. I've been doing that ever since. And it's one of the reasons why my conviction of the truth of Christianity has grown. Now, the Freudian argument is important, because people just feel, well, look, your parents were believers, your grandparents were believers, and so far as you know, your great-grandparents were Christians, and you're Irish, so it's Irish DNA, Irish genetics, and that's all there is to it. It was therefore very important for me to learn that people can change their worldview. Now, before I get to that, my parents were Christian, but they were very unusual in a country that was riven with violence on the Protestant and the Catholic sides, and we may come to that later. But amazingly, amidst a lot of bigotry, they weren't bigoted. Not only that, they didn't constrain me, they allowed me to think, and I will be forever grateful to my parents for giving me space to come to my own conclusions. Now, this argument that we tend to remain in, if you like, the religion that our parents had is a very common one. And I usually am very upfront with audiences and tell them what I've just told you, that my parents were Christians. And I was in Sydney debating the very famous Professor Peter Singer, who's an atheist professor of ethics and very well known. And I told the audience in Melbourne Town Hall this, and he immediately said, "Well, there you are." He said, "That's my major objection to religion. People remain in the same worldview in which they were born. And I thought this is going to be very interesting. So when I got a chance to speak, I said, Peter, tell me, were your parents atheists? Oh yes, they were. Ah, so you remained in the same faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, I'm sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. And the internet went mad at that moment. Here was a world-famous professor of philosophy who didn't realize that his atheism was a faith worldview. And that's one of the big problems today. But to answer your question, I think the best answer has been given by Manfred Lutz, who's a German psychiatrist. And he says this: if there is no God, then the argument that religion is just wish fulfillment and it affects a culture like Ireland and so on, the argument that religion is nothing more than that, the atmosphere of the culture and so on, is a very good argument if there's no God. But he said if there is a God, the very same argument works for atheism. The desire for there not to be a God, for you not to have to be accountable. And then he delivers what I think is the killer blow. And he says, as to whether there's a God or not, that argument does nothing whatsoever. It can't answer it. You have to look elsewhere. So it seems to me, number one, the argument actually is a two-edged sword. But secondly, it was very important for me, personally, to engage with people that did not share my worldview. And I entered into a discussion with one of the first-year mathematicians who was an agnostic. And after 2 years, I think, he came into the lecture and I could see he wasn't listening to the mathematics. And I said to him after, what's wrong with you? He said, well, let me tell you this. He said, I've been thinking about this for a long time, but last night in my room, I knelt down and I received Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I was deeply moved by this because here was a direct experience of someone changing their worldview. But there's a lovely little anecdote in the Singer story. After the whole thing was over, a friend of mine went up to Singer and said, I believe you are of Hungarian Jewish origin. He said, that's exactly right. He said, I am too. Oh, said Singer, that's wonderful. And then my friend said to him, but he said, in Australia I became a Christian. So the very first person he met was a counterexample to his assertion. And I think it's very important for me to say this. My faith in Christ is evidence-based. I think there are reasons for believing not only in God, but that the Christian faith is true. Otherwise, I wouldn't sit here for one moment. And I think that's a very important thing in a world where there's a lot of relativism in thinking, postmodern ideas and so on, where everybody has their own truth. When it comes to science, everybody doesn't have their own truths. They wouldn't last in science for a millisecond if they thought that. And I feel exactly the same is true when it comes to the Christian faith. Sorry, it's a longish answer to your question.
That's very
but you
helpful.
said you were going to let me talk a lot. So
it's great to hear from you. And what you've done actually is take us to the cusp of the beginning of your studies and your own journey from growing up and then beginning to expand your intellectual life. And you studied mathematics, you have studied science and then other disciplines. How is it possible, just to build on that last phrase you noted about evidence and your own understanding, how is it possible for someone to be a scientist and a Christian?
Relatively easily, actually. First of all, from a historical perspective. And fortunately, my parents, who were not highly educated, but they saw the value of education, and they encouraged me to read very widely, way beyond Christianity. And one of the things I came across, I think first of all in C.S. Lewis, was the interesting historical fact that in the rise of modern science, so we're talking about 16th, 17th centuries, we're talking Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and then coming up to Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, Faraday, all of these pioneers, geniuses, were believers in God, many of them Christian. And that arrested me because it was quite clear that their faith in God hadn't hindered their science. It was the motive that drove it. And C.S. Lewis puts that together very neatly, as usual, brilliantly. He said, men, and I'm afraid, ladies, there were no lady scientists then. There are many brilliant ones now. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. So faith in God actually was a stimulus for science. It's not only that. Some time ago, the professor of science and religion in Oxford was an Australian called Peter Harrison. And he not only developed that thesis, but he said that the reformers actually contributed to the rise of science in the following way. He said their attitude to Scripture was, in general, let's see what it says. Let's not come to it with preconceived ideas in some kind of imaginative or even imaginative perspective, but let's see what it says. And he says that attitude transferred into science was, let's not decide a priori what the universe has got to be like. An example of that is the argument from Aristotle that perfect motion is circular, so all the planets must move in circles. And so they had to try and force that on the universe. No, forget that. Let's actually see how the planets behave. And of course, Kepler came up with equally perfect ellipses. Peter Harrison argues that that contributed greatly to the rise of science. So there are two lines of approach historically to a link between faith in God and the rise of modern science. And that weighed a great deal with me. The second point is, I think, that science, and this is a problem in the contemporary world much more than it used to be. That's why I gave my fairly recent book the title, Can Science Explain Everything? And I do not believe that is true, and it's highly misleading, even though people at the level of Stephen Hawking put that idea around. Science is brilliant, but it's limited. It only can answer certain questions. And the main questions science answers are, how does this thing work? Or why is that bit there? That is the why of function. But it cannot answer the why of purpose, and particularly the question that is on most people's mind, the most important question of all, and that is, what is the meaning of my life? And the really great scientists, and Sir Peter Medawar was one of them, Nobel Prize winner, and he said it's so easy to see that science is limited. It cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of my life? And he added, we have to turn to literature and philosophy and, of course, theology to answer these questions. And I think if we once grasp that science is powerful precisely because it limits the kind of questions it can answer, then that opens us up. You see, if science could answer every question, half the departments in this school would have to close tomorrow. There'd be no history, there'd be no languages, there'd be no music, there'd be no literature, etc., etc. It is absurd to think that the natural sciences can answer everything. But you just need to watch for a little hook there, because some people use the word science in a much wider sense, as Germans do, Wissenschaft, to cover all knowledge. And then, of course, science can answer everything, explain everything by definition, because explanation is what we mean by what gives us knowledge. But we're talking about the natural sciences. And if you think of my own University of Oxford, you would be surprised how many leading scientists in the university are confessing Christians and not remotely embarrassed by it. Quite a large number. And indeed, think at the top level, between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners believed in God. That's a statistic that very few people are aware of. It is quite remarkable, actually, how much faith in God there is among scientists, much greater than we think.
So I was just about to ask about that feature of scientists today, because your answers began with history, but your experience today with your colleagues is that it's not an outlier here and an outlier there. It's common.
It's moderately common. When, let's say, when they did a survey of working scientists in the US, they took 1,000 working scientists. Now, not Nobel Prize level, just they did that survey in the early 1900s, and they repeated it again about 80 years later. And the percentage of scientists who were prepared to say, I believe in a personal God who answers prayer, had shifted by about 2%, from 38 to 36, which is quite surprising. At the highest level, unfortunately, they didn't do the research then, it is much lower. But at the moment, we have a Nobel Prize winner alive in physics who is a Christian, and we have a number who are not Christians. And I think what that helps you to see is the issue is not science versus God. If there's one point I'd like to stress tonight is that this idea of a conflict between science and God is almost a pure invented myth. And it's enough to take 2 Nobel Prize winners to defuse it. Peter Higgs, Scotsman, won the Nobel Prize for predicting the existence of the Higgs boson. And Jim Phillips is from the US, and he won the Nobel Prize for his work on low temperature physics. Now, what divides those 2 men? Certainly not their physics. They both won the Nobel Prize. They're geniuses. But what divides them is their worldview. One's a Christian, the other's an atheist. That tells me immediately that the conflict is not between science and God. The conflict is between the 2 worldviews of theism, belief in God, and atheism. And there are scientists on both sides. So we need to change the question to make any progress in this debate. We need to be asking, look, does science give us pointers towards God? Or does it give us pointers towards atheism? Or is it completely neutral? That's the real question. Because it is obvious, it seems to me, that science and God are not in principle in conflict, even though that's a dominant view among the public around the Western world.
Thank you. Professor Lennox, I'm just going to pick up on the fact you mentioned Freud, that his view is that we, similar to Peter Singer, that we just sort of pick up and accept those truths that we're taught. Freud may even go a little further, that our mind may be working well, but really it's to cope in a manner of wishful thinking with suffering in the world. Whereas Marx is less kind. He would say that Christians suffer cognitive malfunction because of a perverse social structure. But so as both of us sitting here on this stage are Christian believers, and so do we suffer from cognitive malfunction or accept a baseless superstition? How do we decide what is true? That's my question.
Well, I may suffer from it, but you don't. How do we decide what's true? Well, on the basis of evidence. I know no other way of doing that. And I think that if you talk about truth, and you've mentioned the word truth, from a philosophical point of view, there are essentially 2 major criteria for truth. First of all, is it consistent? Does this give us a consistent story? And secondly, does it cog into what we know of reality? And I think that Christianity scores on both of those. But I'd like to say something about this wishful thinking being evidence of cognitive dissonance. And again, I owe this to C.S. Lewis. I was faced with this question yesterday, actually. I don't know who asked me, but somebody pushed me up against this question and said my faith in God was simply wishful thinking because I wanted there to be transcendence. I wanted there to be another world where I'd live forever and so on. I said, do you ever wish to eat? He said, of course I do. I'd like to eat right now. He said, I do wish to eat. I said, would you feel that I should use that as an argument that food doesn't exist? It's only wishful thinking. Would it not rather be the case that it would be very surprising, and this is C.S. Lewis again, very surprising to find yourself in a world where you had appetites that cannot be satisfied? And he got the point. We get thirsty, there is water. We get hungry, there is food, and we have other appetites, and there is the means of satisfying them. So the wishful thinking argument just doesn't weigh for me, because I want to come round the other side and say, is there any evidence here? And cognitive dissonance, I would want to go right to the top here and say that the founder of Christianity, if I might put it that way, Christ himself, lived a life that's utterly remarkable in all directions. His teaching is the sanest teaching you'll ever meet. And if you ask yourself about his sanity and his cognitive capacity, they are staggering. A friend of mine, Pablo Martinez in Spain, has just published a book about Christ's sanity. And it's a most interesting book. I've not quite seen a book like it before. Well worth reading. Just getting across that this is the sanest of things and the exact opposite of any sign of madness, of cognitive dissonance, as you put it, etc., etc., etc. The evidence is there. In fact, not only was he himself sane, he brought sanity into many people's lives and transformed their lives. And you see, again, from the point of view of the evidence of truth, I'm a pretty practical chap, even though I'm a theoretical mathematician. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And in my experience of life, I meet many students and young people and speak in many universities all over the world. And from time to time, I will be questioned publicly in a university by somebody who's really suffering and feeling absolutely at their wits' end as a student. And once I was giving a lecture, if I might tell a little story to illustrate this, at Harvard. There were a couple of thousand people in the audience. And when I'd finished, a Chinese student stood up at the balcony and he shouted at us all, "Look at me." And of course we all looked at him. And he was addressing me, really. And I said, "Why should we look at you?" Well, he said, 6 months ago, I was in Penn State University, and you gave a talk there. And he said, something clicked, and I started on a journey. And in the middle of that journey, he said, as far as I recall, he started reading the New Testament, and he met one or two Christians. And he said, "I met Christ." And he said, "Just look at me." He said, "I was at my wit's end, now transformed." And you know, ladies and gentlemen, when you've seen this, as I've done again and again, it's not a proof as in mathematics, but it's evidence. You see people who may be in despair because of a drug problem, a relationship smashed, all this kind of thing. And you meet them 6 months later, and instead of alcohol, there's food on the table and so on. You say, "What has happened to you?" And they may say something like, "Well, I met Christ," or "I became a Christian," or "I was born again." They may put it different ways. But when you see that again and again and again, as I have done, you add 1 and 1 and you get exactly 2. There's something in this business. And of course, even though I'm an academic, what interests me is the effect of this. What is the end effect of believing this stuff? Is it cognitive dissonance, or does it bring sanity and peace above all things into people's lives? And Christ made claims like that. He claimed if people were to trust him and receive him. Now this may sound a bit like jargon to you, but I always say to people, you need to listen to what Christianity claims before you reject it. And I find many people have rejected it, particularly people from my country, before they've even listened to what it says. Christ says that if we're prepared to repent, that means turn away from the mess we've made of our own lives and possibly, sadly, of the lives of others, and trust him as Lord and Savior, we will receive certain things. They'll happen to us. We will have peace with God. There are very few people I ever meet who don't want peace. We'll have forgiveness. We'll have real hope. And we'll have power to live in a way that is fulfilling. Now those are big things. And it seems to me it's that cumulative evidence that is ultimately the answer to your question.
That's very helpful. Now, I have questions about human origins now and ultimate origins, but just want to pick up on your mentioning Jesus, his character, his teachings, but there's also his miracles. It could be the case that the transformation is a result of perhaps shedding unwholesome behaviors or negative thoughts or something like that. But Jesus wants to go further and make a claim to be the one who rose from the dead. Now, if we were to say, with David Hume, that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature and we rule them out, isn't that a scientifically sound thing to do?
No.
And doesn't Christianity fall as the resurrection falls?
No. Oh, Christianity falls, the resurrection falls. But David Hume's argument is not sound. And I think I can show you why it isn't sound. David Hume has influenced generations of people ever since the Enlightenment time, when he made this statement that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. The word violation is very interesting. We don't use it so much, but if you go to the United States, you'll often see a sign on the highway, violators are towed, if you park in the wrong place. That used to disturb me because I was afraid of being a violator who might be towed. But you see, the confusion rests precisely there, that the laws of nature are not like the laws of a country. Now let me explain this. I'm staying in a hotel tonight in Monmouth, okay? Suppose I'm here for 3 nights, which I'm not. So night number 1, I put £100 in the drawer beside my bed. And night number 2, I put another £100 in the drawer by my bed. 1 plus 1 is 2, £200. I wake up on the 3rd morning and I find 50 quid in the drawer. Now, do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of Wales? Yeah. Now you're laughing, and that's good because you've seen the point. The laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Do you notice that? The laws of Wales have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. And you see, Hume's argument depends on a fundamental confusion at that level. In order to recognize, now what has happened in that room? I made a mistake in thinking that the room was a closed system of cause and effect. Now that's what many a contemporary colleague of mine, scientists, philosophers think. Many people think the universe is a closed system of cause and effect, so that nothing can happen that is not describable by the laws of nature, you see. But you see, the laws of nature in science are not like the laws of the land. They tell us what normally happens, provided that nobody puts an event or intrudes himself into the situation. For example, the law of gravity will tell you that if I drop this, which I'm not going to do, it'll fall. But the law of gravity won't stop somebody else catching it before it hits the ground. And here we sit in a universe where I firmly believe in the laws of nature. as our descriptions of what normally happens. And God has made a universe with these laws on which we can rely, the seasons and all the rest of it, and they're very important for the regulation of life. And we know them and recognize them. That's why and how that if God does something special, we can recognize it. If you didn't know it wasn't normal for people who die to remain dead, then you wouldn't be surprised by resurrection. The disciples and the early Christians were amazed. Why? Because they knew the dead people remained dead. So the first point I would make on this, that Hume was wrong, seriously wrong. Now I can confirm that in another way, because the major interpreter of David Hume's argument for a long time was Anthony Flew, the philosopher from Reading. And not long before he died, I met him. And I talked to him about these arguments. He had written books on Flume, and Anthony Flew was in a way the Richard Dawkins of his day, a top atheist. And I said to him, "Sir," I said, "what about your books on Hume?" And he said something that was astonishing for a senior professor. He said, "I was wrong about Hume." And he said, "My books need to be rewritten, but I'd never lived to do it." And Anthony Flew came at high old age to believe in God. Why? Because of the phenomenon of the nature of DNA having a language type structure, that is the genetic code. And he could see, as many of us see, that codes do not arrive through natural processes, either through the laws of nature or through chance processes. And he came to believe in God. And that was fascinating. The two things: one is faith in God, and secondly, his disavowal of Hume. So I feel, first of all, that answering that, and I owe the illustration, by the way, I should acknowledge my sources, that illustration about the hotel and the money is due to Lewis. Lewis helped me enormously, you see, because I have no idea what it's like to be an atheist and an adult. And I needed somebody to map that territory out for me. And I'm old. I'm very old, ladies and gentlemen. I used to listen to C.S. Lewis actually lecture in Cambridge, and that's another story. But he helped me enormously in understanding enough of the philosophy of science, even as a teenager, to begin to see through this stuff. And so Hume does not tell you that science in principle rules out miracles of the kind you find in the New Testament. Now we need to be careful there. You can claim all sorts of things. The word miracle is used all over the place. It's a miracle that Susie passed her exam because she did no work. Well, we're not talking about that kind of thing. I hope there are no pupils like that at this school. But anyway, but resurrection, Christ turning water into wine, and all this kind of thing. And I did a debate with Richard Dawkins. You can see it on YouTube. I've got a website, by the way, johnlennox.org. And Dawkins just, on one of the things, he just mocked me for believing that Jesus turned water into wine, all this kind of thing. To which I said, if he is God incarnate, as he claimed to be, the creator, turning water into wine wasn't a big deal. And it's important that we get these things into proportion. But coming to the next step, since science cannot say a miracle like the resurrection cannot happen, how do we decide whether it did happen or not? Well, we have to investigate two things. One is history and the other is psychology and experience. Because we can approach historical facts, any historical fact. How do I know that Caesar invaded Britain? How would you prove that? We can't say, oh, we'll repeat it in the lab and see if it really happened. You can't do that. And we have to realize when we're thinking about science, there are two kinds of science. There's a sort you can repeat in the lab, and that's wonderful if you can do experiments. That what we call inductive science. But then there's abductive science, where we can't repeat it. I hope you like Hercule Poirot or Inspector Morse. Do you like Inspector Morse? Well, if they find a dead body in an Oxford college, and Oxford colleges in those films are absolutely full of dead bodies, you know, because the Oxford dons are cruel and vicious and all this kind of thing. Morse doesn't come in and say, oh, it's very easy to find out who did the murder. We'll just repeat it and see who did it. Well, that's absurd. So you can't get at a murder then? Yes, you can, because forensic science picks up the evidence. If A did it, then we'd expect B. We observe B. But you see, if A did it, you wouldn't expect to find C, and we found C. So maybe X did it. Now, if X did it, we'd find A, B, and C. So there's more evidence for X doing it than there is for whatever the other one was who did it. And we call that an inference to the best explanation. And we use that all the time, even us parents with children who robbed the sweet jar and pinched the sweets. And you'll use that kind of inferential argument to find out. And therefore we can approach the resurrection in that way. Now, one of the things I did because of this objection by David Hume, in my book Gunning for God, which is readily available, I spent 2 chapters dealing with Hume and then dealing with the historical evidence as I see it, and the experiential evidence. The experiential evidence is, of course, what I mentioned earlier. Christ rose from the dead, that's the claim. So he's still alive, and the claim is he can influence people today. So that's part of the evidence. So I look at it from those 2 perspectives. So Hume didn't deliver the killer blow that he thought he did. Many other people think that he did.
Yeah. Thank you for that. There's, I just want to tell people who are sitting here that we're going to go to Slido in a moment. There are some things that you've mentioned that play into other issues, and you mentioned appetites, human appetites. And if we were to take an alternative view of truth, we could say it is that which helps us to survive. And ultimately, what feeds human appetites or human survival will yield a way of living which helps us to adapt. So I think of, I was reading a fellow named Anthony O'Hare. Who, he said, one cannot move directly from biological success to truth. So here's my question. Can the product of mere natural processes yield truth? That is truth ultimately just a survival mechanism? What we call true is what helps us to survive.
Well, I think that true things may well help us to survive. It is true that this is a bottle of poison. So if I know that truth and avoid drinking it, it'll help me to survive, won't it? So there certainly is a relationship between truth and survival. But the concept of truth, that's a completely different matter. That is an abstract intellectual concept. And what you're asking, do material processes produce that? I don't see how. Just as material processes cannot in the end produce meaning and language. Now, what we're circling round here is one of the things that has characterized, sadly, a lot of modern, vocal science, the Dawkins type of thing and so on. They are ontological reductionists. Now, what they mean by that is everything is reducible to material processes. It's like saying this Rembrandt painting is simply molecules of paint on molecules of canvas. And of course, you can't see the beauty of the painting through that. And I was taught quantum mechanics a long time ago by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, the late, who often in his books points out that this view that you can reduce everything to physics and chemistry and material processes is actually suicidal. It cuts its own, well, it shoots itself not only in the foot, which is painful, it shoots itself in the brain, which is fatal, because it reduces thought to the firing of synapses in the brain. And he said, this doesn't make any sense at all, and all of us know it cannot be true. And quite a range of people are realizing that. And what has interested me greatly, because I'm very interested in this kind of argument, the validation of thought, which is necessary to do science. All scientists, like myself, believe that the universe is at least in part accessible by the human mind. That is a fundamental belief. You know, every scientist is a person of faith. Please don't buy into the idea that faith is a religious word that means believing where there's no evidence. Faith is a normal word, and all of us know and know reasons for those in whom we have faith or things that we believe. Evidence-based faith is part of everyday life. And all scientists believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe, as we put it. And we believe that thought is valid. But why do we believe that? And a number of people have pointed this out, starting with Lewis and people before him. But in the contemporary world, Thomas Nagel is a brilliant philosopher from New York. And he's an atheist. He's a hard atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God, but he sees a problem with this view. Because he said if evolutionary naturalism is true, which is the view that you're quoting, just giving it another name, then there's no reason to trust what our thoughts produce. So thought collapses. And Lewis put it beautifully. He said any theory that undercuts and invalidates thought cannot be true because you reach it by thinking. So that's the end of that. In other words, I see this, and this might provoke you a little bit more. Not only does Christianity and faith in God sit beautifully with science, what doesn't sit well with science is atheism. I think there's a strong conflict between atheism and science. Leave religion out of it. Because I'm told, and I often have fun with scientists when I meet them, I say, what do you do science with? And when they've stopped talking about a billion-dollar machine, I point to my head. Oh, they said, you mean and they hesitate a little bit these days, the brain or the mind, because many people don't believe there's a difference. I do, but we'll leave that for the moment. I say, you do science with your brain. Give me a brief history of the brain. Well, they said, it's obvious. The brain is the end product, coming back to your point, of mindless, unguided processes. And I look at them, and I smile, and I say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, if you knew that the computer you use every day was the end product of mindless, unguided processes, would you trust it? And you know, ladies and gentlemen, I've always got from some of the leading scientists in this world the answer, no, I would not. Well, I said, you've got a problem. You're trusting this, and you believe it's the result of unguided processes, and yet you wouldn't trust. You have a problem. And they do have a problem. You see, let me spin this up onto the big scale. There are two ways of looking at the world. The one is to say it starts with the processes, mass energy, and in popular physics these days you start with nothing and it produces everything. That's another story about which I've written a great deal. But it starts with mass energy and you end up with mind. The other view is in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be with the Word. That's starting at the other end. It's starting with mind, the mind of God, a phrase that Stephen Hawking once used in one of his books. So that in view number one, the atheistic view, mass energy are fundamental, everything else, including mind, and the idea of God, because there isn't a God, is derivative. In Christianity, it's the opposite, that mind is prior and everything else, including the universe, is derivative. That's a massive difference. And that's why I said to you earlier, these two worldviews are diametrically opposite to one another. So those are the kind of things that we have to consider in this whole connection.
Well, that hopefully gets to one of our Slido questions, which I'll read in a moment. But there'll be some RS pupils here, sixth formers, who will have been taught Lord Russell, famous atheist, sort of the Dawkins of first half of the 20th century. And the thing that I have them memorize is his statement that the universe is a brute fact.
Yes.
Just take it as existing and written. And then, unfortunately for that notion, a different theory of the origins of the universe arose, which undid that. So we teach those same pupils the last things that Stephen Hawking wrote. That if you take the Big Bang as the best theory, well, where did that come from? And he made some statements about, given these natural laws, the universe created itself.
Yes.
So the question on Slido is this: are the Big Bang and Genesis compatible?
Well, there are several things behind that. Of course they're compatible. Well, I shouldn't say of course, that's unfair. It's a very sensible question. What is the Big Bang? Well, the phrase comes from Sir Fred Hoyle, whom I knew a little bit and discussed these things many years ago. He was a famous astronomer, and he marked some of my exam papers at Cambridge, but we'll not go into that. You and your Big Bang. It was really a pejorative statement because he believed the universe was in a steady state. He didn't believe there was a beginning. And like many other people at the time, and I remember the time, this is the 1960s, not the 1860s, please, but the 1960s, I remember the evidence for a beginning to the universe was just coming in. It was strongly resisted by people like Hoyle. So they made a joke, your Big Bang. But the Big Bang is just a label on a mystery. And what is it saying? There was a beginning. In other words, it's saying exactly the same as Genesis. It's not an explanation of anything. It's simply a description that there was a beginning. So in that sense, it's perfectly consistent with Genesis, except that Genesis tells us a great deal more. And you made the point when you were formulating the question. Yeah, you said, given the laws of nature. Well, Hawking neatly bypasses where the laws of nature come from. And he makes the absurd statement that the universe can and will create itself from nothing because there is a law like gravity. Well, when I first read that, I thought, what? Because there is a law like gravity, the universe will create itself from nothing. Because there is something, the law of gravity, or something like it, the universe will create itself from nothing. But that's a flat contradiction. Because there's something, you get the universe from nothing. But then it got even worse. The universe will create itself. Now, if I say to you X creates Y, roughly speaking, it means if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, in my book, it means that nonsense remains nonsense, even if a brilliant scientist says it. It's a completely nonsensical statement. And that troubled me. Because here was a brilliant, absolutely brilliant mathematical physicist. I remember him in Cambridge when he began to get Lou Gehrig's disease and was walking around, talking utter nonsense. And what has disturbed me greatly is a number of other physicists and astrophysicists have followed him in doing that. And it seems to me that if you have to talk nonsense to get rid of the idea of God, you're saying something to the world. And I find it very difficult to even entertain that. It's anti-intellectual talking nonsense.
Well, his number 2 in his unit at Cambridge was at our church and disagreed with him on those things. They were obviously both doing science but disagreeing.
Oh, well, that's absolutely so. You know, Stephen Hawking was a mathematical genius, but Lord Rees, who's not a believer in God, said, I've known Stephen for many years, and he knows little philosophy and no theology, and I wouldn't trust anything he says about it. And he said that in the obituary, which was quite an open and honest thing to say. I've actually written a book about God and Stephen Hawking, which deals with all these arguments. It's just a little book in case you're interested.
Yeah. And his physics were astonishing.
No, absolutely astonishing. And if one might have hoped that he would have got the Nobel Prize if they discovered, he predicted something called Hawking radiation, but unfortunately no.
Now, I wanted to ask you a question which is, in a sense, about suffering and some current events, but I do want to be faithful to Slido.
Yes.
So our next question is, how often does science affirm the Bible and existence of God? Does science ever manage to disprove the existence of God or the Bible? So that's two questions. They've cheated.
It's about 1,000 questions, actually, if you sort it out. It's a generic question, and generic questions are very difficult to answer. What particular thing in the Bible does it contradict? And I think the way I approach that is to look, first of all, at the big things. And one of the biggest things we've just touched on, that the universe had a beginning. Genesis has said it for thousands of years. But the natural scientists didn't come across it until the 1960s. And I was at a meeting of scientists and other people in a country in Europe some time ago, and they were discussing all this question, could we talk to each other, philosophers, theologians, and so on. And I was the token Christian, and I mentioned the beginning, and I was interrupted by a very well-known physicist, and he said, Professor Lennox, please tell us you were joking when you said that the Bible had any relevance for us today. There was dead silence. And I thought, what do you do now? And I said, well, I wasn't joking. I said, incidentally, I was alive in the 1960s when evidence for the beginning came in, and it was resisted by top members of the United Kingdom scientific establishment, including the editor of Nature. Why? Because it gave too much leverage to people who believed in a creator. And I said, I know, as you know, the Bible is not a scientific document. I don't teach algebra from Leviticus. I assure you, in case you were worried about that. I don't. But it does talk about some of the things that science talks about. What I mean by that is this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is a statement about the world that scientists think about. So there are many statements, but not a great deal in the Bible that overlap with what the natural sciences study. Now I said, let me make a suggestion to you. This is still at this meeting with this chap standing on his feet who was heckling me. I said, if the scientific world had taken the biblical worldview more seriously and they decided to investigate the claim that there was a beginning, I just wonder whether you'd have got there sooner. I've finished it. You see, it seems to me that, of course, I don't pretend the Bible is a textbook of science, but there are ways of corroborating it particularly from historical science. And the way I start to answer this, because it has a throwback on the reliability of Scripture and so on and so forth. And there's a number of books that have been written by people who started as atheists and decided, well, it's pretty obvious if we can show that, say, the Gospel of Luke, who claims to be a historian, that he's got it wrong. He's got the names of towns wrong, the names of seas, the names of lakes, of different council officials and so on wrong. And these people, and there are one or two notable examples of this, have investigated and they've come out as Christians because they've discovered that it's authentic. So I think the only way to deal with a question like that is, what specific things are you referring to? And it's very interesting. Sometimes you wait years for corroboration. For example, the book of Daniel, which I've also written, talks about a king called Belshazzar. And nobody had ever heard of Belshazzar, so he didn't exist, so Daniel was writing fiction, all this kind of thing, until a stone turns up and there's his name on it, and that's the end of that. Now, it means, of course, that you've got to be patient. So the question is, do I have, as I sit here tonight, enough evidence of the trustworthiness of Scripture in general to stake my life on it? And the answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, in my case is yes. There are lots of questions I still have. I'm a natural skeptic. I ask questions. But I have enough evidence to trust. And that's the important thing that people need to ask themselves. Do we have enough evidence?
Thank you. I would like to ask you something, but I'm just going to resist and go to Slido here. Oh, there's a top question. Let's see here. I beg your pardon. So top question here is this. If Christianity is true, are other religions untrue? If Christianity is true, are other religions untrue?
My approach to this question is, well, from a couple of directions. Let's come to something that we've already discussed, the resurrection of Jesus. I have friends in most religions because I've read their literature and documents and talked to people. Now, as for the resurrection of Jesus, my Jewish friends believe that Jesus died but did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he did not die. I believe he both died and rose again. Now, I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, all three of those things cannot be true simultaneously. So that's a historical point. And my Muslim and Jewish friends will agree with that, by the way. They think that what they believe is actually true, and it differs from what I believe to be true. So how do you settle it? On the basis of evidence. We cannot avoid the investigation that I've spent my life doing in a way, and that's why I've written about it, to try and make it a little bit more concise for some people. So that's the first approach. But when we begin to talk about other religions, there's a great danger in the discussion, and it's this, that the moment I would start to criticize another religion, if I'm not careful, people will think I'm looking down on them. So I want to say something that's very important. If you take all the religions in the world and all the philosophies and investigate them morally, you'll find a deep, common fund of morality that everybody believes. Now that may surprise you. Again, I came across this as a teenager because I read a book by Lewis called The Abolition of Man that everybody should read. And at the back of it there's an appendix where he goes through and he takes as an example the golden rule, do unto others as you would that they do to you. And he finds it and writes it out in dozens of different religions. It's in all the religions we've mentioned. It's in Buddhism, Confucianism. It's in Roman pagan religion. It's in humanist philosophy. It's in Marxism. It's all over the place. Everyone believes the golden rule. Now that's a most interesting thing because from where I sit, it shows that human beings are made in the image of God with a common moral conscience on certain issues. Now, of course, there are variations. So when I'm asked about this question, I'm very careful to say that I, as a Christian, could be put to shame by an atheist in their moral behavior. That my understanding and evaluation and reaction is not a moral criticism. Now that's important. You get that in the Bible itself. Abraham, the famous father of the three monotheistic religions, he was put to shame by a pagan pharaoh of Egypt who rebuked him for his duplicity. So asking this question, it's very sensitive that I'm not thinking you are worse than me because you don't believe what I do. But when it comes to differences, we've seen there are historical and factual differences. Now, let me come to the other side of it, which is the question I was asked this afternoon because I was doing a Zoom conference with America. And the interviewer said to me, look, there's so many religions. Why are you a Christian? Similar question, really. What is the difference? Well, I'll tell you what I think the issue is. What is a religion? That's the first thing we are to face. And I've asked many people that from all sorts of religions, and generally they come up with something like this. They say a religion usually prescribes a path of behavior to be followed. It often has an induction ceremony. You join the religion in some way. It may be in birth, or it may be you go through some sort of ceremony. Then you try to follow the path. You have people to help you, gurus, imams, priests, ministers, all sorts of folk to help you. And you try to stay on the path, whether it's the Eightfold Path or it's this path or that path. And in the end, you are faced with an assessment of your life. And if your good deeds weigh heavier than your bad deeds, and you hope that that will be the case, then you will be received into whatever it is, heaven, nirvana, you name it. So that's what religion is. Now, I meet many people who say they're Christian, and that's what they believe. That it's simply a path, you follow and you do your best, and you hope that God will receive you at the end. Now, I shock people when I tell them that that is not Christianity. You see, it's a bit like a school, or let me use a university, since I left school about 100 years ago. University, you get in. And then you've got all these marvelous professors to teach you. But you know, they cannot guarantee you get a degree, however nice they are. I cannot guarantee the students that they get a degree. Why? Because the principle is merit, individual merit in passing the final exams. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Now, many people I've spoken to, seriously spoken to, that's what they believe about religion. Well, if that's religion, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not religious. Because Christianity is not a system of meriting God's acceptance at all. It is utterly and radically different. Acceptance in religion comes at the end of the journey. Acceptance in Christianity comes at the beginning of the journey. That's the difference. And it's a huge difference. So when a person trusts Christ, as I mentioned before, and that's a step of commitment, like marriage is, they receive acceptance then. So they live afterwards not to gain acceptance. By the way, I should make it clear, I'm not coming here tonight to talk about these things to get brownie points with God, you know, to gain his acceptance. I do it because I have his acceptance. Now, many people have rejected Christianity because they haven't understood this. And the reason is that if you conceive of religion as trying to follow rules, that can be bitterly disappointing. And it can end up as a kind of slavery. In the end, you get fed up. It's like keeping New Year's resolutions. You keep off chocolate for a week and then you gorge on it. And you try to reform, and it's hopeless. And old Aristotle discovered, and St. Paul discovered, that it becomes an absolute slavery. And because people conceive of religion as a slavery, they often just say, this is hopeless, forget it. But there is another way. And I'm going to explain it by using a very simple illustration. I saw a girl many years ago. She was rather beautiful. And so I thought it'd be very nice to get married to this girl. So I came and talked to her, and I said, I'd like you to marry me, and here's a present for you. So I gave her Mrs. Beaton's cookery book. And she said, what's this for? Well, I said, look, let's look at apple strudel. I love apple strudel. So I said, look, let's have a look at this. If you're going to make apple strudel, thou shalt take so much sugar, so much flour, etc., 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 and thou shalt bake it at a temperature of 400 degrees centigrade, or maybe a bit less. Now I said, it's going to be like this. If you keep the rules of this book, let's say for 40 years, let me be kind, then I will accept you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. Why are you laughing, ladies and gentlemen? Because that's how millions of people think of God. That's how millions of people think of God. They would never insult a fellow human being by making acceptance depend on performance. Of course, I didn't do that, by the way. I did buy my wife many cookery books. But she cooks not to gain my acceptance, but because she's got it. And that's what makes the difference. And what is tragic, I'll never forget once going to Bulgaria in the Academy of Sciences. They were all scientists. And I told that illustration. And there was a man in the front and his mouth just fell open. And I couldn't help noticing him, and I spoke to him afterwards. He said, do you mean to tell me as a scientist? He said, I thought I was a Christian, but I was following you all the way. That's what I thought. I have to keep the rules and hope that one day God will accept me. Do you mean? He said, surely, do you really mean that if I trusted Christ like you said today, I could have that acceptance? And I said, of course. Well, he said, it was worth your while coming to Bulgaria to tell me that today. Ladies and gentlemen, let me repeat what I said quite a while ago. Don't reject Christianity until you understand what it says. Because this is utterly revolutionary. People need peace. They need certainty. And that's why in marriage, my wife accepted me at the beginning. For what reason, I don't know. I accepted her for many reasons I do know. And 53 years later, we're still there. It's the same with God. And we can know that personally. So that's the reason I'm a Christian, not something else. Because, to put it another way, Jesus doesn't compete with anyone else. Why is that? He offers me something that none of the others do. So it's no shame to accept from Christ what nobody else offers me. No other religion, no other philosophy. There's not a competition because what he offers is utterly unique. And when we see that and respect other people for their moral stance, I think we can have a real discussion.
Professor Lennox, we're so grateful to you. We have so little time. We have so many questions. I have 14 questions still left on my sheet to ask you. I think I need to just ask one, which is of a different sort.
Yes, sure.
In a sense, you've said that we can have all these ideas about God, and there's a revolutionary life-giving, peace-giving message that you've described, which is always surprising and wonderful. But doesn't God have something to answer for in terms of what we see going wrong? What about the beautiful country of Ukraine and bombs falling there today?
Yeah. I love Ukraine. I've been there about 40 times, ladies and gentlemen. Every city where the bombs are falling, I know it well. So it breaks my heart to see what's going on. This is the hard problem. Perhaps it's not so hard for many of my atheist friends who just say, well, it's a brute fact, this is the way the universe is. It's a hard problem for me. And the problem of suffering is the hardest problem. In the first week of the coronavirus lockdown, I sat down to write a book. Where is God in a coronavirus world? That's still available. Where is God in a Ukraine world? And this problem affects us all, whether it's on the scale of a country or an individual scale. If you've just heard you've got cancer, or you've a broken relationship, or a loved one has died, where is God? Why does God not do something about it? Now, this is a very seriously important question. There are no simplistic answers to it. But I do believe there's a way into it. And it depends a little bit on how much time we've got. Have we got 2 or 3 minutes?
We have 2 or 3 minutes
Yes.
to crack the big
Because
question.
this is really a question for a whole evening. And I apologize in advance that this will be inadequate. But if you want to see a bit more, there's masses on my website about this. And I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. And I was faced with this and meeting people who'd lost their loved ones. And if you Google my name in New Zealand, you'll see longer talks and discussions that I had on radio and television out there. But let me try and sum up very briefly. Where I see a way in, not a big answer, and that's the answer, and that's it, and we all must accept it. The first thing is that many people react to this and say, well, there is no God, that's the solution. And that gives them a way out intellectually, certainly. But it doesn't remove the suffering. It does remove all hope by definition. That doesn't mean it's false. But it certainly doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't bring any comfort to anybody. In fact, it can make things a great deal worse, which again doesn't prove that atheism is false. But we may want to look elsewhere. And I could talk about this philosophically, and I would, you see, if people look at that and they say, well, clearly there's evil in the world, and they're atheists, I said, then where do you get your concept of evil from? Or good? If everything's just the result of natural processes and chance, evil isn't a concept. And a Russian author, Dostoevsky, saw that very clearly when he wrote a long time ago in The Brothers Karamazov, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. What he meant by that was not that atheists couldn't behave well, but that there's no rational justification for a concept of good or evil if God does not exist. Now we could pursue that, but because we've got very limited time, I want to say where I see a way into this. And I see a way into it because the God I believe in revealed himself, came in human form in the person of Jesus Christ, and the center of Christianity is the fact that he died on a cross. Now what does that say? Well, at the very least, and try and come with me, if Jesus actually is God incarnate as he claimed, then that cross tells me that he hasn't remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. Now that's a huge step forward. A God that understands suffering. But if the cross had been an end, we'd never have heard of it. But it's the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. He's broken the death barrier. And the reason all of us are afraid of suffering is because of death. There is a fear of death in the human heart. But Jesus has broken the death barrier. Now, of course, the fact that I trust him doesn't mean I won't die of COVID. or by an act of violence, or by an act of a natural disaster, a tsunami or an earthquake. It doesn't mean that at all. But it means that I have a hope beyond death. Now that's where I begin to see. Now I happen to know that at this very moment there's some very brave people, often young people, students in Ukraine, staying there and ministering to people and helping them and going and with this very message, because they know that even though bombs are raining down on them, there is a message that can bring ultimate hope into even that kind of circumstance. Now this is hard for us to accept. I find the news very difficult to watch at the moment because I know all these places and many people there, hundreds of people there actually, over 20 years of traveling to that one country and to Russia as well. So I approach it by the fact that in the Bible itself, it takes this question seriously. There is a story in John's Gospel of a little nuclear family. And of course, suffering, many people may suffer, but all suffering is individual. And nuclear families are hit. And this little family consisted of 3 people, Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. And Jesus was miles away and he got really ill. And the sisters sent him a message. Lazarus is ill, and he didn't come, and the man died. Where's God in all of this? So that raises the problem, as nothing else does. They knew Jesus had the power, but he wasn't there. Why isn't God here? Where is God in this? And he eventually turned up after the man was dead. And one of the sisters came out and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And he then talked about the resurrection. And she was quite theologically astute. She said to him, Lord, she was pretty tough. She said, Lord, I know the resurrection the last day. He said, Martha, no. I am the resurrection. Now, she didn't quite grasp what that meant, because in a few minutes he was going to speak and raise that man from the dead. The other sister came out, and she just burst out weeping. And Jesus did not try to talk to her philosophically, theologically, or any other way. He just wept too. Now that shows me what the heart of God is like. He weeps, but he allowed it to happen. Now that's where the mystery is in all of this, ladies and gentlemen. This is a universe where there are ultimate mysteries, where God allows things to happen. And if I was sitting here and didn't have that solid hope that one day Christ would speak and raise me from the dead, I would have nothing to say to you whatsoever. Atheism has nothing to say on this topic whatsoever, except you've got to accept it as a brute fact. That's how it is. But at least, it's more than at least, but at least Christianity can point you to someone who knows about your suffering. And you might see Ukraine on TV and see them suffering, but you may be suffering a broken heart, a disease that you know is going to be terminal. And for you, that's as big as the suffering of a country, because that's the way suffering works. And therefore, again, I would say to you, don't throw away the Christian answer until you've thought carefully about it. Because I never forget, I gave a talk and in New Zealand, 3 days after the earthquake, I think it was, or maybe 4, and there was a piece of paper waiting for me afterwards. And on it said, I lost my husband. What you said has given me the first hope that I have found. I was deeply moved by that. It brings hope to people. It brings reality to people. But it doesn't necessarily solve or get us out of having to suffer.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry that we are, the clock has gotten the better of us, but we're so grateful to you. We'll express our thanks in a moment. I'm thankful to Olivia, who introduced you, and I'll ask Max to come up to give a word of thanks. But we are so grateful to you. There's going to be some free resources and a book and some refreshments. And I'll just state that unfortunately, Professor Lennox needs to go quite promptly, so he won't be able to stay and interact with many of us. But let's express our thanks, and then we'll hear from Max. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.